Well, the sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and my mullet's in full bloom. It's summertime. What am I doing here? I gotta finish the brakes on the Corvette. Hi, I'm Cam Vanderhorst for Corvette Forum. On the last episode, we replaced the leaking brake master cylinder in my 1986 Chevrolet Corvette with the master cylinder from my 1987 Corvette parts car. Today we're going to give that same attention to the rest of the braking system and wrap things up. Got all kinds of new parts here, including these Hawk HPS brake pads. These things are excellent. We got these from KNS Brakes. You should check them out. I've had these HPS pads on quite a few of my cars before. Some good stuff. I'm excited to see how they perform on the Corvette. I'm also replacing the stock rubber brake hoses with these braided stainless hoses from Russell. And I'm going to finish things off with a set of new rotors, good old AC Delco. I'm also going to pull the 34,000 mile calipers off this car to replace the 104,000 mile calipers that are on this car. Once everything's back together, I'll show you how to bleed the system and how to bed in your new pads and rotors so everything works the way it should. My 1987 Corvette parts car has these really cool Enkei aftermarket mesh wheels. Enkei actually manufactured some of the factory wheels for early Corvettes. Now, I don't have the tool to get this center cap off, but I've owned quite a lot of BBS style wheels with this style of center cap, and I think I've got a way to get these off without damaging them. I want to keep them nice because they're in great shape and I've never seen a set like these before. And I've got a friend with a two-tone silver and gray 85 Corvette that these would look perfect on. So I'm going to first loosen this set screw. And then I'm going to use this strap wrench try to get a decent grip on here. If I can, it should just be a simple quarter turn to get this off. Damn, I'm good. With these lug covers off, these look a lot like Enkei 92s. You see a lot of Enkei 92s and a lot of late 80s, early 90s tuner cars, and I've seen them on Fox Mustangs too. They look good on everything. At first glance, these calipers don't look much different than the ones that are on the yellow car. But like finding a good partner in life, it's what's inside that counts. These calipers have about a third as many miles on them as the yellow cars. That means less wear and tear on the pistons and seals. Once we clean them up, they'll look as good as new. These are the calipers off of the red 87 parts car. We're going to clean them up a little bit before we install them on the yellow car. Ideally, I'd like to eventually powder coat them or paint them so that I don't have to worry about this oxidation anymore. As you can see here, there's a big difference between the caliper before and after we cleaned it. Once they're all cleaned, they look really good. But I decided that since I had everything apart, might as well go ahead and paint them. Added a lot of extra time to the project. It was a classic case of while you're in there-itis. But as you'll see at the end of the video, it was totally worth it. If you read the instructions on your can of high-temperature paint, they recommend curing the paint in an oven to aid in durability. I have this toaster oven that I haven't used for cooking food since my bachelor days, so I've repurposed it as a paint curing oven. I shouldn't have to tell you this, but you should never prepare food in the same oven that you use to cure paint. The instructions recommend curing the paint for an hour at 200 degrees. Even though regular use will cure the paint eventually, doing this beforehand will protect our paint job from fluids and chips during reassembly. Be sure to use standoffs like the ones I'm using here to hold your part in place while it cures. Any part that is touching your standoffs or a rack will sag, so plan carefully. This step added a lot of time to the process, but overall, I think it was worth it. When I bedded my pads in, I put the brakes through some serious heat cycles. It was a relief to see that all of my hard work hadn't flaked off and embedded itself to the inside of my wheels. The worst part was that every time the toaster oven dinged, my lizard brain would automatically assume that pizza rolls were done. But no, it was just another dumb brake caliper. Meanwhile, here's what we're dealing with on the yellow car. Notice anything? Those spring clips are supposed to be on the inside of the caliper, not the outside. All four wheels were like this. I'm sure much of my Corvette's poor braking performance could be attributed to the leaking master cylinder, but I'm pretty sure these incorrectly installed pads had something to do with it as well. I wanted to take a moment to show you how to remove your old brake hoses. I've never seen a really good video about getting these off before, and for all I know, this may not be all that helpful either. For what it's worth, you don't have to replace these things very often, maybe every 30 years or 100,000 miles or so. Since I was overhauling the rest of the system anyways, it made sense to me to replace them with braided stainless units that flex less under hard braking than rubber ones do. First, you're going to want to soak the fittings with penetrating oil. The brake line fittings at the wheels are 12 millimeters, while the hoses themselves are 17 millimeters. Your new hoses may use a different size. Mine did. Anyways, you'll want to use a special flare nut wrench specially made for brake fittings so that you don't round them off. If you do, well, you're hosed. Or, in this case, not hosed, I guess. I used my jack handle as a breaker bar to get a little more force on this nut, but be careful and make sure that the nut is breaking loose and not twisting the line, which can happen if your fittings have rusted to the brake line. You kind of have to do this by feel. I don't show it here, but there's a retaining clip for the line that you can just grab with some tongue and groove pliers and wiggle back and forth until it's free. Hope this helps. Good luck. Since I'm installing all of these shiny new parts, it seemed like I should spend a little bit of time cleaning up the fender wells and suspension. I used a degreaser and a stiff bristle brush to break up most of the dirt. The beautiful aluminum front suspension components are on full display with the hood open, but mine were covered in decades of accumulated grease and grime. It seems like nobody had bothered to clean off the old grease when they re-greased the ball joints. I see a lot of C4 Corvettes like this, and it's a shame. I used a scraper to get off as much of this grease as I could. With all of the big stuff knocked off, I hit it with the pressure washer to take care of the rest. What a difference. And that was about it for day one. Alright, day two. We've got our suspension and fender wells cleaned up nice. We've got our parts car calipers all painted and ready to go, and we've got all of our new parts ready to install. I also learned a very valuable lesson yesterday. When it's 90 degrees outside, a black t-shirt and jeans is not the greatest wardrobe for working on a Corvette. Alright, so here's the thing. If you've done brakes on an early C4 Corvette, you've probably already realized my mistake. No, not cleaning the brake rotor off with brake cleaner. That is really good advice. You should always do that. I'm talking about something else, which I'll explain in a few minutes after I go through all the effort of installing everything. You'll see what I mean in a bit. Just stay with me, or if you feel so inclined, take to the comments to call me an idiot, because I know a few of you probably will anyways. Alright, so with that out of the way, it's time to reinstall your caliper bracket once you've placed your new rotor on the studs. Make sure you have those bolts torqued down tight. You really don't want this coming loose. Next, reinstall the rubber boots on your slide pins, grease the pins up with the packet supplied with your new pads, and slide them into the bracket. Make sure your boots are seated on both the pins and the bracket. The next step is to use one of these brake caliper piston tools to fully compress the piston. Place the inner pad in the caliper and tighten down the tool until the piston is fully compressed. Now, place your pads on the bracket. Pay careful attention to the orientation of the pads. Make sure you're installing them correctly. Next, I like to thread the lower bolt through the caliper itself into the slides so that the caliper can hinge into place. On the front brakes, I ran into some clearance issues with the pads, so I removed the outer anti-rattle clip on each side so that the caliper would slide into place. Make sure that the springs on the pads don't pop out of the caliper when you do this. Remember, they belong on the inside. I'm going to hold on to those anti-rattle clips in case my brakes start getting noisy. When I take everything back apart to work on the suspension, I will probably reinstall those clips when some pad material is worn down. So far so good though, no noise. Use a 17mm wrench to hold your slides in place while you tighten your caliper bolts with a 15mm socket. Don't forget to reinstall your bleeder screw. Be careful not to over-tighten these and snap them off. We're almost done. The last step is installing the new stainless brake hose. This takes a little finesse and it's arguably the most crucial part of the install, so pay attention and take your time. I like to get the thread started on the metal brake line, then clock the line in place where it meets the caliper. Place a washer on the banjo bolt, push it through the fitting, and then place another washer on the other side. Thread the banjo bolt into your caliper and make sure those washers are seated correctly. Once everything looks good on the caliper side, tighten the brake fitting to the other end of the hose, and make sure it's still at a good angle to the caliper. Then you can reinstall the retaining clip. I like to use a rubber mallet for this. In case you haven't noticed, I like using a rubber mallet every chance I get. And we're done. It's time to take care of the other three wheels. Oh yeah, let's take a moment to address that mistake I made earlier. Alright, so those of you who've done a few of these might have noticed a very simple, very easily avoidable mistake we made on the front. Early C4 Corvettes have the same outer diameter rotors, front and rear. One big difference is that these are domed, these are flat for the parking brake. We had put the rear rotors on the front of the car because I had looked up the part numbers incorrectly and didn't bother to double check. It's always a good idea to get all of your parts out in the open when you start. Lesson learned. Let's get the rear together. Yeah, that fits much better than trying to put a front on the rear. As a finishing touch, I installed some split loom over these sensor wires, since most of the original insulation had long since dry rotted and fallen off. This will protect the wires underneath, and it looks nice too. Now that everything's installed, let's roll that beautiful brake footage. Ah yeah, that's the stuff. All that's left to do is bleed the system, and I'll show you how to do that next. Alright, we've got everything back together. Now for the fun part. We're going to refill the master cylinder and start bleeding the brakes. So now we're going to start bleeding the brakes. To bleed the brakes, you need a bottle, a hose, a line wrench, and a friend. I've got my neighbor John. Say hi, John.
Hi.
So usually you want to start bleeding the brakes with the wheel that's the furthest away. But for some reason the factory service manual for the Corvette says you start with the left rear, then the right rear, then the left front, and the right front. So we're going to do it the way the manual says, see how it goes for us. Alright John, 3 pumps and a hold.
Okay.
Between each wheel, you'll want to top off the brake master cylinder. So you can see, we went down from the max level to the minimum level, just bleeding that one wheel. If you forget to do this, you might end up sucking in air and undoing all of your hard work.
Lots of pedal travel on that one. Tons of air. Nice.
Pedal moves maybe an inch. That's amazing. That feels great. That's what this car should feel like. So bedding in your brake pads to your brake rotors is a lot like braking in your engine. You've got moving parts that you want to kind of mate to each other. You should look up your pad manufacturer's suggestion for bedding because everybody does it a little bit differently. Hawk wants us to do 6 to 10 stops from between 30 and 35 miles an hour to a complete stop, and then 2 or 3 stops from 40 to 45 miles an hour to a complete stop. Then it wants us to let the brakes cool for 15 minutes. After that, you should be good to go. Pretty simple. That's what we're going to do now. Find a nice secluded area to do it and make sure you're not bothering anybody or upsetting anybody just by starting and stopping a lot. Let's go. There's one. Well, the brakes are all done on the Corvette. I hope you had a happy 4th of July. As for me, I'm going fishing.